Hi, everybody. My name is Tom Hastings, and I'm an educator here at Cheehaw Park and Zoo, Flint River Aquarium, and Thronatiska Heritage Center. And today we are going to be talking about the life cycle of plants and some basic plant parts. And this is a really important topic, and we're going to talk about why this is so important as well. So to help us work through this, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because I have some slides that I think will be really useful. Just give me 1 second. Okay. All right, so when we're thinking about the plant life cycle, there are three major components, but we're also going to talk about some different processes that happen in between these three major areas of a plant life cycle. And those processes are going to be really important for moving from one stage of the life cycle to the next. And so the life cycle of a plant is going to start as a seed. And so this seed is made up of three primary components or parts. And so that's the embryo, the endosperm, and the seed coat. So what you can see here is that the seed itself is found inside of this fruit. Now we're going to talk about why that's really important as well a little later on. But I figured we could break down these three major parts or components of the seed itself. So first we have the embryo, and what the embryo is that is basically the really young baby plant or the undeveloped plant that needs to begin growing within that seed. And then we have the endosperm. That is a food source that is available to the embryo within that seed that's primarily based out of starch or things like sugars. And that's going to be really important because this embryo inside the seed, this multicellular organism or baby plant, needs something to provide it nutrients so that it can begin growing and developing over time. And then lastly, there's the seed coat. So this is going to be multiple protective layers that are surrounding the seed. And this is going to be very important for a number of different reasons. First, it's going to be important just for protection from physical damages. So we're going to talk about later seed dispersal and different ways in which seeds can move. So having an outer coat that can protect it as it's moving around is going to be really important to protect the embryo and the developing plant inside while it's still really young and fragile. And then also, seed coats are going to be really important for allowing the seed to maintain or to retain moisture within that seed coat. So we don't want our plants to dry out before they even have a chance to grow and develop. And so having that outer layer is going to be really important for allowing the plant to retain moisture and water and not get dried out. This is something that was really important for plants being able to move on land. So when plants are on land, they may, develop in areas that's not in standing water. And so being able to remain hydrated or retain moisture is really important. And this is one of those characteristics that's really important for plants being able to survive in areas where there may not always be standing water. But before a seed can really start growing and developing, it needs to be fertilized. So before that plant or that embryo internally can start growing and developing, it needs to be fertilized, which means essentially pollen needs to reach the eggs of the female plant to fertilize the seed and initiate this growth. And so this is why pollination is very important, and we're going to talk about pollination later as well. But that's really important to note that before the seed can start growing and developing, and that embryo can start growing and developing, it needs to be fertilized for that process to begin. Okay, so before we move on to the second stage, I want to talk about an important process, which is known as germination. So once the embryo has grown and developed, it can remain inactive for a period of time. So before a plant actually germinates and sprouts, it remains inactive, or it remains in a period where it is what we call dormant. And so essentially this seed that is fully grown now and the embryo is developed inside It's inactive and it's waiting for the right conditions. It needs suitable conditions for it to be able to actually germinate and sprout. And so once that seed is fully grown and developed, what it's going to have is internally in this seed right here on the far left, while it's inactive, it is now at this point developed a root internally. So it's got a little root inside that's waiting to come out of the seed, which is going to be the first thing that's going to grow out. So the first thing when the germination process starts is the root is going to start to begin to grow downward, and tiny little root hairs are going to be available to start collecting nutrients and water to really help continue the growth and development, since the endosperm is going to be used up for the most part, which is that food source. Remember the sugars and the starch. And then internally, it's also going to have developed some shoots, which are going to become what is going to be the stem eventually. So it's got the root, the shoots, and then lastly, it's going to have developed some little leaves that are going to be tucked inside this seed as well. And depending on what type of plant, there's different types of plants. There's lots of variation in plants, but some plants will use the leaves just as parts that are going to sprout out. But in some plants, those leaves actually sort of replace the endosperm, and those are what's going to store the food and nutrients available to the seed. But regardless, all of these things have developed inside the seed as that embryo was growing. So again, we have the root, the shoots, and the little leaves. And so once suitable conditions are met, so there's enough soil available, there's enough nutrients, water, and sunlight, and maybe even proper temperature, the germination process will begin because the conditions are right for the plant to start growing. And the first thing, again, that's going to happen is this root is going to start growing downward because it wants to get further into the soil where its root hairs can start pulling in nutrients and water. Once that root hairs pulls in nutrients and water, which is necessary for the plant to keep growing, we are going to see the plant start to really grow now then that shoot, or that shoot that's going to become part of the stem, and we will have the plant sprout above ground. So this soil layer, the plant has now sprouted above ground and germination has been completed. So what that is essentially, that process is the process of the seed transforming or developing into a young plant now. And so that's more of a diagram to show this process. But this is some pictures of some live plants. So you can actually see this is where the seed was, and we had the root coming down, right? So this is the initial root growing. Like I said, that's the first thing that's going to happen is the root's going to start growing down, and then eventually hairs will start growing off of that primary root. So our secondary stem or roots is what we call that, is our root hairs. And then we'll start to see leaves coming out of the seed. So you can still see the seed is retained all the way up here. And then the shoot will start forming, or that stem. And then what's going to come off of that is those leaves. And so this is what it looks like over time. And then this is the part that you will see coming above ground out of that soil. So this plant is germinated, and this is now what we call a seedling. Or in some cases, if we're looking at things like a tree, it can be called a sapling. So over here, you can see we have our seedlings or our saplings, which is our little trees. And so at this stage, what's going to become really important is the process of photosynthesis. So plants are what are called autotrophs, which means they need to make their own food for growth and development. And so leaves are going to become very important at this stage, as well as their roots, because now they are reliant on themselves to gather nutrients such as that water and the nutrients from the soil, which has already started, right? When they were germinating, we saw the roots came out first so that this sapling could even sprout above ground. But they're going to need to do it even more to support further growth and development. So at this stage, they are going to become competitive for resources so that they can complete photosynthesis. So now leaves are going to become very important too. And so leaves are one of the primary parts of the plant that are responsible for making the food and completing the process of photosynthesis. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But I just wanted you all to be aware that that's the next key component of the life cycle of a plant, is once they are a seedling or a sapling, they now are responsible for completing photosynthesis, making their own food, and pulling in resources from their environment to make that own food so that they can begin to really grow and develop and become competitive with other plants in their surrounding. And once plants continue to grow and develop long enough, and once they become structurally sound, they will include all of the plant parts. So these plants still have, which I don't have pictured here, which I should, is they still have the roots, right? Because they are growing this tall now. They still have a stem, all of these leaves. But what you'll notice in these pictures now is that they don't just have anymore the roots, the stems, and the leaves. They also now have flowers and fruits. A lot of plants will have fruits as well. And so what that indicates is now this plant is reproductively mature. It is mature enough or old enough that it can start putting energy into developing flowers. And so again, flowers or fruits. And so that's what's really important, because this is where those seeds are going to be made again. And once a plant has flowers and they get pollinated, remember earlier I was saying that for the seeds to start really growing and developing that embryo inside, it had to be fertilized. Well, when a flower gets pollinated, that's what's going to initiate the fertilization of the seed and the growth of the embryo. So once a plant is an adult, this is an adult plant now, it will contain all of the plant parts, which includes the flower, and that's really important for being able to develop seeds and to attract animals for pollination. And then once those seeds are developed from this adult plant, that's going to restart the life cycle, because then that seed can go and start a new plant, right? So that is the three primary stages of plants in their life cycle. It is the seed, the sapling or the seedling, and then the adult plant once it grows enough. And then we talked about germination as the process of finding suitable conditions. But there's two other processes I want to talk about before we move on to the basic plant parts and how they help the plant. And that is pollination. So in all three of these pictures, we see plants, but what we're looking at primarily is the flower on the plants, right? So I mentioned that a plant isn't going to grow flowers until it is fully mature and has those reproductive structures. So a flower is the reproductive structure of a plant. And this is really important because what you'll notice in all three of these pictures is these flowers are really pretty colors. And so they look cool to us and we like flowers, but that serves a really important role. And the role of flowers is to be able to look attractive and to smell good and to look good, so that pollinators or different animals such as insects, such as the butterfly and the bee, and animals such as a hummingbird are going to be attracted to these flowers, and they're going to want to come pick up nectar. So sometimes flowers will have a really tasty treat inside as well, known as nectar. And so that's what's attracting these animals. And while they're on these flower parts, they're going to pick up that pollen. So remember earlier I was saying pollen is necessary. That's the male reproductive cell that needs to be transferred to the female plant parts or flower parts. And so as these pollinators go from flower to flower, plants are hoping that they're going to transfer pollen from the male parts of the flower to the female parts. And when that pollen is transferred and the male and female reproductive structures come together, that's when that seed will become fertilized. And at that point, again, remember, the embryo can start developing inside the seed. And that's how plants reproduce. So pollinators are very, very important to plants. And that's how seeds can get fertilized and start growing and restart that life cycle. But after the seeds develop and they are fully developed and they're dormant, remember they're inactive still at this point, they can't just stay at the same plant, or else we wouldn't have plants dispersing and moving over space, right? Like we don't find all of the same type of tree at the exact same spot. Plants spread out and they grow and they cover different areas. And that's because seeds disperse. So dispersal is very important for plants to be able to, extend their range and have more individuals. And dispersal can happen in a number of different ways. So the first up here, you can see wind is carrying these seeds. So the seeds are found at the very bottom of this structure. And those feathery type structures are what's going to allow these really lightweight seeds to blow in the wind. And then as they blow, they're going to eventually land in a new location. And then that seed is going to wait to germinate. So once it finds a new location, if the conditions are suitable, remember they need those proper environmental conditions. If wherever they land, the conditions are suitable, a plant or that seed will start to germinate and grow that root and the stem and the leaves, and it'll go through that germination process, and hopefully a sapling will start to grow. There's other techniques. So a lot of seeds can be transferred from water. If you think about it, if one of these seeds blows into the water, let's say in a stream, it's going to carry downstream until it reaches its final location. So a lot of plants can be moved through water. A lot of plants have really cool specialized features such as hooks or, kind of sticky or sharp parts that are going to attach to animals. So let's say a deer walked by this plant. This is what's called a burr. That burr is going to stick to the deer. And as that deer continues walking, it's going to drop that seed in a new location eventually. And then again, if the conditions are favorable or suitable, then a plant can begin developing wherever that animal dropped it. And then lastly, oftentimes seeds are found inside of fruits. So that's why we oftentimes find our seeds inside fruits we eat. Like that peach, that first slide I was showing you had the seed with the three components, the embryo, the endosperm, that food source, and the seed coating. But that whole seed itself was also found inside of fruit, right? So what's really beneficial about fruits is that's another way to attract animals that will disperse seeds. So a lot of animals like to eat fruits, and so when they're eating fruits, they're also eating the seeds that are found within that fruit. And then when they move, they're going to continue to move and walk around. And then whenever they poop, they are going to drop the seeds out as well. And that's another way that seeds can be dispersed. And also, we as humans move fruit around all over the place. And so we also like to eat fruit, and we can also disperse seeds quite a bit. So this is really important because once those seeds have been fertilized and have developed, they still need to be able to move to different locations and establish new areas. And so there are lots of different techniques for seed dispersal, whether that be being found in tasty fruits or having cool ways to move around the environment. Okay, so that is the life cycle in a nutshell. I mentioned we were going to talk about the three primary life stages as well as some important processes related to it, such as pollination and seed dispersal. Both of those are super important for being able to really aid in that process of the life cycle of plants. But there are also some things I wanted to mention about plants in general. So while that all helps to get to the adult plant, what are the different parts of the plant that actually really allow them to be successful? And so there's a number of different parts. So I'm not going to cover flowers because we just talked about flowers, but right, that's the showy part of plants that attracts pollinators or can include fruits that will also attract animals to eat them and move them around in the seeds. So we've talked a lot about that in the life cycle itself, but we didn't really mention leaf stems and roots, other than that those are different parts that develop over time with the plant. But I wanted to focus a little bit about why some of those plant parts are also really important to the growth and survival of the plants. So the first one I want to talk about is the leaf. So I mentioned earlier that this is primarily where photosynthesis happens, and that is why leaves are so important to plants. They're really like the powerhouse or the food source for plants. And for plants to be able to continue to grow and develop and grow new branches and get nice and tall and big, they need to have food available to them. And like I said, plants are autotrophs, so they make their own food. And that happens primarily in the leaves. So what's really nice about leaves is that what they're going to do is they are going to collect energy from the sun. So the sun is the primary source of energy for plants that is necessary to fuel the process of photosynthesis, right? So what photosynthesis is when plants make their own food. So again, they use the energy from sun, and then they will combine water and carbon dioxide to make glucose or some sugars. And then eventually that glucose needs to be broken down into a usable form, and that usable form is what will allow plants to grow. And so that's why leaves are really important. A lot of leaves, such as maple trees, have really broad leaves that are going to be really efficient at collecting a lot of sunlight so that there is lots of energy to make that food for the rest of the plant. But then there's also, we see leaves on things like pine trees that have needles that are really small. But what's really nice about that is those needles are better in some environments than others. So plants can be able to survive in different locations. So, for example, needles may be able to survive in colder locations and allow pine trees or things like that to survive in colder locations or where there's less sun available, because those needles are actually packed with a lot of what we call chlorophyll that will be able to maximize how much sunlight they're pulling in. And then it also prevents them from losing a lot of water because they're surrounded by a tight waxy coat. But regardless, what I wanted you to take away from that is that the leaves are really important for pulling in sun and making that food that's important for the rest of the plant to be able to grow and develop. All right, and then we have the stem. The stem is really important for a number of different reasons too. So the first is that that's what allows the plant to grow nice and tall. So we can think about the stem as like the backbone or the spine of the plant. And so what happens is there is two types of growth that occurs in the stem. There's primary growth, which is when the stem continues to grow from the tip, and it has upward growth, which is what allows it to get nice and tall. But then there's also secondary growth, which allows the plant to grow outward. And that's what allows them to really have the structure necessary to get nice and tall. And both types of growth are super important. And so plants need to grow tall for a number of reasons. If they are found in a location where there's lots of other plants, they need to be competitive to get nice and tall so that they can still have leaves that are exposed to the sun. Because if you think about it, if you're a plant and you're nice and short and you have a lot of tall plants over top of you, you might not get a lot of sun because all the other shades are going to shade, or all the other trees are going to shade you out. So it acts as a nice backbone or spine to make the plant nice and tall. The bark is found on the stem, which is a nice protective layer. So sort of how we were talking about the seed has a protective layer on the outside. Bark can be a nice protective layer for the plant. And so that can help retain moisture as well and protect from physical things such as getting eaten. And then lastly, the stem is going to be really important for moving food from the leaves, right? Because all the food is made there from the photosynthesis to the roots and other parts of the plant. And it's also going to be important from the opposite ends of the spectrum to be able to move water and nutrients from the roots up the plant to the leaves so that they have the water and nutrients necessary to complete that photosynthesis. So you can think of it as kind of like a transport site or a place where lots of movement can happen. All right, and then lastly, we have our roots. This is going to be our underground plant part. And this is important too for a number of different reasons. So we think about roots being really important because primarily what they're nice for is being able to take up water and nutrients from the ground. And that is really important because they need that water, again, for photosynthesis and also nutrients. So nutrients support the growth of a lot of different plant structures, such as the flowers and the leaves. And so what these root hairs will do is they'll take in water and nutrients, and then again, the stem can be used to transfer what they collect to the rest of the plant. But roots also play some other roles. So they can actually store food. And so if there is a time period where the plant has to kind of, shut down photosynthesis, say during the winter or something like that, where they drop their leaves in some plants, or if it gets way too hot and plants have to close their leaves up a little bit to retain moisture, then they can't be photosynthesizing or making that food. So roots can be a nice site of food storage. And then lastly, roots are really good at anchoring the plants into the ground, right? So they need to have a really strong structure at the bottom that can, first of all, make sure they don't topple over and stay nice and upright. But also think about if there's really strong winds or if there's like really strong floodwaters moving through. The roots are just really good at helping keep that plant in place and anchored, as well as all the soil around that plant. So really important structures for those reasons as well. And then, so yeah, that pretty much sums it up. And so I just kind of wanted to give you an idea of not only do these plants grow these different parts during their life cycle, but kind of how the different parts contribute to that growth and development during that life cycle so that they can ultimately become an adult and get to the point where they can have those reproductive parts such as the flower and the seeds that will start the life cycle of another little plant. And so that's why I included this picture, because it also shows the different resources that a plant needs to be able to grow. So to support all these different plant parts and all of that growth that I was just talking about, plants need soil and the nutrients in the soil. They need water. You can see here on the leaves, that's going to be important for photosynthesis. Water is also important for moving the different food throughout the plant and getting to the leaves. You can see there's some sun shining on the leaves, so we've talked about that being important as the primary energy source for photosynthesis. And then also these plants are going to be taking in carbon dioxide that they also need for photosynthesis. So I hope you all learned about the basic life cycle of a plant and how it moves from seed to adult, what the different plant parts are and how they play an important role in that plant growth and survival, and then also what the resources that are necessary for plants to be able to grow and survive. And remember, to even be able to have a plant germinate, they need suitable conditions with some of those resources present. So with that, I hope you all enjoyed this and learned something. Thanks so much for joining, and I hope to see you all soon. Take care.